Welcome. The fact that veterans who have served their country and are thrown in the scrap heap is not particularly a new subject. For that matter, neither is the alarming and often underestimated number of suicides that happens for vets. But what isn't often talked about is the people in the organizations who are actually making a difference with these vets, often bringing them back from the brink and returning them to their families and to their communities. These are people who really have been sort of in the darkness of their soul. Well, that's where we're going over the next two episodes with our guest, Matthew Whiz Buckley, here on the Dov Baron Show. Matthew is a veteran, a C-suite executive with extensive leadership experience from the front lines to the front office. He's a former decorated Navy fighter pilot, graduated from Navy Fighter Weapons School, that's known as Top Gun, you might have heard of that. And he flew 44 combat missions over Iraq. While on active duty, he taught himself how to trade options and became a successful trader for over 30 years. However, while continuing to run his businesses, Whiz focused on stopping veteran suicide with the help of psychedelic-assisted therapy. I know that's a controversial subject, but it's going to be a fascinating one because that's a conversation we're going to have over the next two episodes, so stay curious. Welcome to the Dov Baron Show. Come for the stories, stay for the learning. Join the movement of deeply curious learners by hitting that subscribe button right now. The Dov Baron Show is not just another podcast, it's your passport to unparalleled insight. Each episode features the wisdom of global leaders, scientists, entertainers, philosophers, theologians, and journalists. Our guest for the next two episodes is Matthew Whiz Buckley. His work with the No Fallen Heroes Foundation is transforming the lives of individuals who, for all intents and purposes, have been abandoned by their country or the people they've served. These people being served by the No Fallen Heroes Foundation are not just vets, they're also first responders, people like you, trying to cope, hiding their trauma while continuing down a horribly self-destructive path that No Fallen Heroes Foundation is bringing them back from. Ladies and gentlemen, turn up the volume and help me to welcome Matthew Whiz Buckley. Welcome, sir.
Thanks, Dov. I appreciate the intro, man. I'm honored to be here and being able to talk about this absolutely important subject.
It's a vitally important subject, and like I said, it's not a new subject. I can remember when we were doing the 22 push-ups a day, and that's pre-pandemic, or as I like to say, BC, before COVID. It sort of raised to the surface, a lot of talk about it, and then it kind of drifted away. As these things tend to do, there's a new cycle, and the next screaming lunatic is going to get the attention, and these important things often get lost. And I know that you've done a lot to make the difference in that. But one of the things we like to talk about at the beginning of every show is nobody is who they are in this moment. There's a catalytic process. There's a cascade of events that start in our childhood. We call it the emotional source code. Can you give us some insights into your emotional source code where you started out that has formed this guy that you are today, even pre-military?
It's a great question, Dov. You talk about BC before COVID. I use pre-medicine. My answer I give you today is so different than I would have given you 3 years ago before I actually healed decades of trauma, not only childhood trauma, but military trauma that we can get into. But I got to tell you, man, sitting here today, I healed my shell. But underneath this shell, man, as I experienced with the medicine, is an absolutely perfect soul. Now, that ain't me saying I'm perfect. This shell is a sinner. It needs work on a daily basis. But if I've learned anything, and we'll dig into this in a little bit, I lost my faith for most of my life. I was sexually abused as a child. We were a stereotypical Irish Catholic family from South Philly, South Jersey. I was an altar boy, going to Mass 7 days a week, Catholic schools. My middle sister, Monica, was killed by a drunk driver when she was a freshman in college. And that was just a hand grenade that changed the arc of my life, but it destroyed my parents. And I bring these things up because a lot of men and women, before they go in the military, they have some childhood trauma, right? So I had some childhood trauma, and then flying fighters for 15 years, I lost 16 buddies. And not one combat loss, 16. Not one combat loss. Mechanical, weather, stupidity, bad decisions, more mechanical, more weather. And also along the way, I lost 3 F-18 brothers to suicide, including a groomsman in my wedding whose picture is sitting right over there. Beautiful bride and 5 kids, put a bullet in his head. I bring all of this stuff up because born a perfect soul as a child, God just put me here, and then 52 years of shame, regret, trauma, drugs, alcohol beat me into something that I'm not. And I thank God to be able to sit here today that 3 years ago, man, I destroyed that shell. I destroyed that ego, and I got back to exactly who and what my emotional source code is. And that's a perfect soul, man. I don't want to turn anybody off. Like, okay, this guy's a fighter pilot saying he's perfect. I am the least perfect thing on this planet. But underneath all this, absolutely. And you are too. Everyone listening to this, one of the most life-changing feelings I ever had was when I was sitting on psychedelic-assisted therapy that we'll dig into, and I dropped to my knees in front of what I assumed to be God, this perfect light, this perfect source that was nothing but love to me. I was on my knees, Dov, and I was crying, and I was apologizing for just being an awful husband, father, human, drunk, druggy, and God lifted me up, and he looked at me and he said, Matthew, I do not make imperfect things. Let me take this backpack off, man. This is not yours. This is too heavy. And he took it off of me and he said, get up and let me show you what you can do. So ever since that day, I've gotten back to that emotional source code.
That's magnificent. It's interesting because you brought up something here that I've spoke about with leaders for 40 years. And I've always said, I have not met a leader. And when I say a leader, I mean somebody who has excelled. I've not met somebody who's excelled, whether they're an athlete, an entertainer, or a business leader, or whatever it might be. I've not met one who didn't go through enormous amounts of trauma. And the problem is the success has become the coping mechanism, pushing them to try and feel whole, try and feel complete, and it doesn't work. I mean, it works for about 10 minutes because you feel fantastic and the accolades are great, and then you are in the silent moments on your own, laying in your bed and going, how come I still feel like a piece of shit when I've gone and I've done all these things? And there comes this moment where you have to go, there's got to be more. Now, when that moment comes, that's an identity crisis. What we call it is an identity crisis. And what most people do with that is exactly what you talked about, is they go to new women or new penises, or they go to more alcohol or more drugs or more distractions to try and alleviate. And of course, it doesn't work. And there's that moment where they realize something's got to change. Now, it's interesting because you brought up that you lost your groomsman, put a bullet in his head, and it's that moment of I can't live with myself. And you know what's fascinating about that is if you think about that, who is saying that to you? I can't live with myself. Well, aren't you yourself? What's this other I versus me? Okay. And that's the moment of transformational opportunity, not transformation, but transformational opportunity. Sometimes that transformation is I'm leaving the physical body, bang, and I'm out.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's something different. What was the moment that got you to go down that path? Because you said you'd lived your life like that for 49 years.
Yeah.
And then suddenly there's something changed. Because it's not the moment, it's what happens after. So what was the moment first that got you down that path?
Dov, I think it's going to be plural. It's going to be moments. Military trauma, losing all those folks. This could be a separate interview, man. But my first and last day at work as an airline pilot was the morning of 9/11. So a couple days after the attacks, I got a letter from American Airlines that said, hey, you're furloughed. So I lost my job and my health care and stuff. But as you alluded to in the intro, I taught myself how to trade when I was on active duty flying jets. So I went to Wall Street instead. I was still flying fighters in the reserves out of Fort Worth, Texas. And I got hired to be an executive in a trading firm in Chicago. And Dov, in a fighter squadron, you trust the women and men with your life, or they're not in that organization. They're gone by lunchtime, right? I got to Wall Street, man, and I couldn't trust somebody to watch my wallet while I went to the bathroom. I mean, these people would push their mother in front of a bus for $1. So I had this crisis of you go from a brotherhood and a sisterhood that have a mission, a well-defined mission. You hold yourself accountable, but you hold your brothers and sisters accountable, to a Wall Street environment. I'm like, man, this is awful. I died a little bit inside each time I walked into the Chicago Board of Trade. That kind of led to booze. Everything you just alluded to, hide away from losing myself and my mission, the booze, the drugs, the women, the just very bad decisions. And that led to some dark nights of the soul. I was a drinker. I don't know if you can be a good drinker, but I was a drinker. I started spiraling the drain, my brother, so to speak. And there was a couple times laying on a bathroom floor where I'm like, maybe I just shouldn't be here. And the thing that saved me was just the images of my bride and my beautiful children that kept me here. And around that time, a buddy's like, dude, you need some help, man. He said, why don't you go try some hot yoga? Right down the street, there's a yoga studio. And I looked at him and I said, dude, if I saw me in yoga pants and doing a downward dog, I'd kick my own ass and take my lunch money. I'm like, you know what? I'll go do it. So I went to hot yoga and I'm like, I've worked out with Navy SEALs. I'm a fighter pilot. I'm in shape. Dov, about halfway through this hot vinyasa, I about had a heart attack. And here's these girls in Fort Lauderdale running circles around me. How embarrassing. So the yoga really started to help me. Then one of the yoga folks was like, you meditate, right? You do breath work. I can't sit still for 30 seconds, man. You think I'm going to sit still for 10 minutes with my mind going blank? That's impossible. Went to a meditation retreat. Wow. So God, whatever word you want to use, source, truth, universe, divine, I choose to use the word God. God had me on a pretty good flight schedule. Got you some hot yoga, Matthew. Got you some breath work. And then 3 years ago, the veteran suicide crisis was heartbreaking. I want to tell the viewers something. Let me update the numbers. This is how bad this is. Our government is about 3 years stuck in lag. So that data is old. They were saying anywhere from 17 to 22 per day take their lives. About a year and a half ago, Duke University and the University of Alabama dug into Uncle Sam's numbers, and they went actually talk to humans. And when they dug into the numbers, they talked to people. They're like, no, that guy drank himself to death or she overdosed. They put the number closer to 44 veterans take their lives every day.
4 veterans a day are suiciding. That's double the numbers everybody's shouting and screaming about. I knew they were much higher, but I didn't know it was double.
When that came out, there's no way the administration or anybody in the government was going to go, let's have a news conference. Breaking news. The suicide numbers are actually double. Of course they didn't, because what we're doing is not working. It's a revolving door between the VA and Big Pharma. We can get into my first medicine experience because many of your viewers probably have seen the movie Lone Survivor or read the book with Mark Wahlberg, who portrays Navy SEAL Marcus Luttrell. So my first medicine experience 3 years ago, when I started a foundation, I'm like, I got to do something about veteran suicide. How do you stop a guy or a gal from killing themselves? Do we buy suits? Do we help them write a resume? Clueless. And again, yoga, breathwork, God dropped this into my lap. A close friend of mine said, hey, there's a group of Navy SEAL veterans that go down to Mexico and they do psychedelic-assisted therapy. And there's a really cool group going in a couple weeks. Would you want to go? And I looked at him and said, go to Mexico and do drugs with Navy SEALs next weekend? That sounds fucking awesome, man. Let's go do it.
The party is not going to be what you expect, my friend. It may be a little disappointed in the music.
I had no idea what I was getting in for, man. So I fly to San Diego because if you do this in San Diego, you're a felon. If you do it an hour south in northern Mexico, it'll save your life. But we can talk about that later. So anyway, landed in San Diego. I meet Marcus Luttrell, the famous Navy SEAL. And then for all the coffee drinkers out there, Jared Taylor, JT. He's one of the founders of Black Rifle Coffee. Another Navy SEAL, a team guy who served with Marcus. And then an NFL player who was suffering from some pretty bad CTE. His name's Robert Gallery. He was an All-American at Iowa. I think 8 years at the Raiders. Great dude. So we took a little convoy from San Diego down to a place called the Mission Within. And I rode with Robert. And I got to tell you, Dov, sitting in the car next to this big iceberg of a dude, he was death. He just was dark and big and just a sad shell. And let me fast forward a year later. This big thing bumped into me at this fundraiser. I'm like, holy shit, is somebody going to kill me? It was him. He was a different human being from head to toe. Let me back up. So you're right, man. I'm like, go to Mexico, do drugs with SEALs. It sounds like a great weekend. I sat with a medicine called ibogaine. So iboga is the most powerful psychedelic on the planet. It's root bark from Gabon, Africa, Central to West Africa. Some think it's the tree of knowledge. In the West, and iboga's got like 13 alkaloids in it. In the West, we pull out one of the alkaloids called ibogaine. It was a 12 to 14 hour, without a doubt, the most spiritual thing that's ever happened to me in my life. After my sister Monica was killed, my dad just checked out, man. I played sports at high school and I'd miss the bus. After school, my dad would pick me up, and in between St. Augustine Prep and my home was the cemetery. And my dad stopped every day and he cried every day at her grave. And I remember when I had kids, I remember sitting there with my dad one time looking at the kids playing, and he knew what I was talking about because I looked at him and I said, Dad, how did you do it? And he looked at me and he said, I had you. And he said, when they lowered her into the ground, I wanted to jump in there, but I had you. So I bring that up because he died years later of a broken heart. My brother and my sisters, my mom, we are convinced he died when my sister died. On the medicine, my sister Monica appeared to me, and she was perfect. She was angelic. And then my dad was right next to her. And I can't remember the last time my dad smiled after she died. And he could not have been more happy. And they were together. And I felt a peace I haven't felt in a decade. But then they started to leave. And I cried out. I'm like, don't leave me. Don't leave me again. And they came back. And this time they smiled at me and they were smiling and they started to go away again, but I followed them this time. And they went into my daughter, they went into the trees, they went into the sunset. They didn't go anywhere. They are right here. They never left me. And I was healed. And then, like I alluded to earlier, just a massive, bright, white light full of love and energy that I knew that was God. And he healed all my stupidity, all my trauma, and lifted me up. And there's a lot of stuff personal that was healed and stuff like that. But Dov, I had to get back and learn an SAT word. And here's your SAT word of the day: ineffable. It means you can't put into words. Whenever I talk through this experience, I fall infinitely short of what I felt and experienced. And it's interesting because as this was going on, there's Marcus, there's JT, and these guys, at certain points, they sounded like somebody had an axe and was hitting them in the shin. But I couldn't move. You're not taking ibogaine and going out to a club, man. You're not going anywhere for a couple of days.
You are going somewhere. You're going on a deep inner journey.
Correct.
You ain't going anywhere externally.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
I remember lying there and they sounded like they needed help. And I'm an aviator, right? They're on the ground. They're my ground brothers. And I remember the biggest decision I made in my life at one point was like rolling on my side, and it took an hour. But I remember I wanted to help these men who saw a hell of a lot more than I did. And I remember God saying, I appreciate that, Matthew. And it was kind of like a look at me moment. He said, look, you can't heal anyone. They have to want to heal. And then that's my job. He goes, I got them, son. Let's go. You and I we got to talk and do some shit, but good on you. But it was so helpful to me that God was like, they're getting exactly what they need, buddy. Let's go. Because the next morning, everybody kind of struggled downstairs and, sit with these guys at breakfast, Marcus, JT, everything was brighter. I remember looking at them, I'm like, you good? And they're like, never better. And I'm like, sounded like you were killing some demons up there. And they said, yeah, we were. So I got back from that retreat, Dov, and I said, this is how we're going to end veteran suicide. And as you alluded to, not only do we help veterans, but a lot of girls and guys, when they get off active duty from the military, they take off that uniform. They don't take off the trauma. And then they go home to their state or their town and they throw on another uniform. I have a Marine buddy, 20-year Marine. He's like, dude, the trauma I saw as a Marine, he went to Miami Fire Rescue. He's like, the trauma I've seen as a first responder, what people can do to children, to each other. So we help veterans, first responders, and their families, because the families serve too. There's currently, at the University of Texas, the Dell School of Medicine has a psychedelic branch. They're using psilocybin, and they're doing a study with Gold Star moms and wives. And I have a buddy who's very close to the study. He's like, dude, you are going to be blown away by the healing these women have experienced. So I got home, Dov, and I said, this is how we're going to end veteran suicide.
You alluded to something there that I think is important, and that is the most successful people are driven by some form of trauma. And these people often find themselves in situations, compel themselves into situations that re-traumatize them. And it's based on the ego mentality of, well, if I survive that shit, I can survive anything. If I can survive being molested by a priest or by my stepfather or by my mother or whatever it was, and I can go through the violence that I went through, I can do okay in this. And that's true by the sense of compartmentalization. It's not mentally healthy, it's mentally unhealthy. And so those boxes, I tell my clients, is those boxes that you sealed away the shit in all leak. They're all leaking into your life constantly. and then you try and close up the leak with a drink or with more success or whatever it might be. But eventually that poison leaks out into the system called your life. And so these people, they take off the uniform and they put on another uniform, which is another level of, oh, well, I'll step into more trauma. And I believe, it's my truth, based on the research we've done, is that you use the term God, I'll use the term universe or creative consciousness or collective consciousness, whatever term a person wants to use. But I believe that we interact with this source, and because we have normalized, and this is important work, and this may help with the work you're doing, Matthew, we normalize whatever this shit happened. And so normal isn't healthy, normal is just whatever you got used to. And so if you were traumatized, that becomes normal. Now, the problem with you having to wake up to that trauma is if the trauma would be equal, it would just be normal. You wouldn't notice. So it has to be bigger in order for you to recognize it. And if you don't recognize it, it just keeps getting bigger until it gets big enough that you pay attention. In my case, all kinds of stuff happened, but the final straw for me waking up was falling off a mountain 120 feet because I was an adrenaline junkie, because that was how I was hiding from my trauma. That wake-up call comes not to destroy you, but to break open the shell of your being, to break open the illusion. And I always say that you're not supposed to put Humpty Dumpty together again. It's been broken open on purpose so that you can reveal the yoke of your being, your soul, of who you are within that shell that has confined you. And so this work that you're doing is, as I said at the beginning, is not just for vets. It is also for first responders, but you're also helping anyone who has gone through any kind of trauma. You talked about sexual military trauma, people who are getting all kinds of things like that. I know people who are in the space that you're in. They're doing the injections to help with the nervous system, to bring that down. I know lots of people doing work with the military and doing this. The bottom line is this, though. And I've had this discussion with a very good friend of mine who is not part of Big Pharma, and he's very clear. He's done this work a lot, and I said, but you got to know, if these people are coming to have the treatment so that they can go back and re-traumatize themselves, that's a problem. So I want to ask you, do you confront that? Do you see that as a thing that's happening? I'm carrying all this trauma, but I want to get back in the seat, and I want to go back and do the same shit again. You see that?
Dov, it's a great point. I think there's a term for it, like psychedelic tourism. When you get home from one of these experiences, it's work. We actually use the term work. It's interesting because when I was at the Mission Within, that next day, I'm like, I'm healed.
I felt the healing coming on.
Hallelujah. It's funny because my guide and the medical director's like, all right, Whiz, throttle back. And they used a ratio of 595. They said, Whiz, 5% is here, the medicine. 95% is when you get home, and it's called integration. And I'm like, that sounds dumb. I think it's 99-1. I think it's actually wrong, man. If you get home and you go back to the same things, as you alluded to, that made you sick, you're actually going to be in a worse situation. Because I tell people that this medicine experience is potentially literally a clean piece of paper. 5 years ago, if I heard me use this sentence, I'd probably give me a wedgie. I was born again. Literally, God cleansed all my shit, man. The drugs, the alcohol, the regret, the shame. And I came home Superman. If you don't change what made you sick getting there, you're going to spiral really super out of control. Now, knock on wood, that hasn't happened because we don't let it happen to people, right? When we get home, we do 4 integration calls. You're talking to your coach, you're journaling, your yoga, meditation, you're maybe even microdosing. There's a good regime to keep you good to go. And Dov, it's interesting because the original guys I went with, we were talking about doing like an annual knock the rust off retreat, or as an aviator, ice build up on my wings, man, I'm going to stall. So old me, I'd spiral down and things would get ugly. New me can recognize, you know what, maybe let me go knock the rust off. I ain't doing it weekly, monthly. This is maybe once every year, maybe couple years, right? And like I said, it ain't fun. So people are like, oh, you're going back to do it? I'm like, I did it like 3 years ago, man. So you're right. It's the new thing, right? I'm chasing after stuff without doing the work. You're going to be in a tough place.
And I really appreciate you bringing that up, Whiz, because everybody we meet is looking for the magic bullet, whether that's doing the intensive with me and a 24 hours in a 1-year program. I tell them 24 hours is going to be mind-blowing transformational and a waste of time if you don't do the work for the following years. And I think that people still looking for that magic bullet, whether they go into a psilocybin experience or they do ibogaine or they do something else. It doesn't matter what it is. Listen, I hear this term that you just threw around, which is, I'm born again. And I'm like, yeah, whatever. Honestly, whatever. And they go, are you disrespecting my Christian beliefs? And I'm like, absolutely not. But I will know you're born again when you're living differently. I don't care what you can quote at me, Bible verses, who cares? How are you living? This is the integrity of your humanity. How are you living? And this is what I'm hearing you say, is that they've got to go away and integrate that. I want to get more into this, and I want to get into why we're struggling with making this more mainstream in part 2 of the show, and what people can do. This is really important because I am not a vet, and I have lots of vet friends who all know I'm a conscientious objector. I would not go to war. I don't believe in it, but that's my belief. But I totally, complete support of somebody who serves their country and goes and does those things, and to throw them in a scrap heap is just insane to me. I want to talk about that. I want to talk about what we can do in part 2 of the show.
I'm going to give them a little tease to go to part 2 because, Dov, we're going to get into some farming stuff as to why these might not be or are frowned upon by the government. But between us ladies, Dov, I believe these medicines, Uncle Sam or whatever government doesn't like, because they have the potential to turn warriors into peacemakers.
Yes.
I was a meat-eating, knuckle-dragging, kill. 5 years ago, I'd have swam across the Atlantic by now to kill as many Russians with a knife as physically possible. Now I'm like, stop. Take a break for a week, man. Go to your corners. You're killing souls. Old me saw shells and hate and sex and race. New me sees nothing but perfect white light killing each other. So that's a nice little tease, Dov, because I think these medicines can turn warriors into peacemakers, and the military-industrial complex ain't going to be happy with that.
Yes, I agree with you. We want to talk about the military-industrial complex, big subject for me. So before we do that, please tell everybody where they can find out about you, about the foundation, how they can help, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, just go to nofallenheroes.com. If you're a veteran, a first responder, a family member, or if you know somebody who needs some help along those lines, on the top right, it says contact us. Fill out a grant request. We got a list, but man, we try and move through it. And that's a shameless plug, or not so shameless, for donations. I don't take a salary. My wife doesn't. We've been funding this foundation personally for the past couple of years, but that doesn't scale. We're kind of a victim of our own success. I call it the world's greatest Ponzi scheme. You heal, you get home, and you want to put the ladder down and help your brothers and your sisters out and heal. But yeah, just nofallenheroes.com, and you can follow us on Instagram too, nofallenheroes, and I think I'm official_Whiz Buckley.
We'll post all the links to all the social in the show notes, as well as how to get to part 2 in the show notes. We'll make sure you have all those links. So if you can't find it, don't worry. Just look in the show notes. It'll be right there. We're going to be back with part 2 of this delicious conversation with Matthew Whiz Buckley and the No Fallen Heroes Foundation and the difference it makes in part 2. Stay curious, my friends. Stay curious. We're going to be back in just one click.